Well, thank you all for being here. I guess before we dive into maybe some questions and perspective from y'all, I just maybe wanted to give the audience some additional perspective on Bernie's life and career. As folks here know, unfortunately, Bernie passed March of this year, entirely too young, at the age of 68. He was a three-time Shazam Award winner in 1972, 73, and 74. Inkpot Award winner in 1987, 2007 Lovecraft Award winner. I mean, the sort of the litany of awards and accomplishments can just go on and on. He certainly created Swamp Thing and House of Secrets, 92 and July 1971. Co-created Destiny and Weird Mystery Tales in July, August 1972 with Marv Wolfman. Neil Gaiman said he was the first comic artist that was really influential in certainly his life. So, really, what we have in terms of a resurgence in horror and, gosh, everything from Vertigo to Sandman, you can draw a direct through line back to Bernie's work beginning in the late 60s and early 70s. So certainly with this panel, I'd like to get some perspective. Everybody here has met Bernie at some point. Certainly Joe, as you mentioned, very close friends throughout the years. First time meeting Bernie, first impressions. What was that first meeting like with him, and what are your first recollections?
Well, it was funny. I had just graduated from the High School of Art and Design in New York City, and I was working at a place called the New York Comic Art Gallery in New York. It was the first gallery of its kind that was kind of devoted to comic book art, and Bernie was having his first official show at this gallery.
Probably, I think it's the first image we have.
Yeah, that's it. Actually, that's the catalog for the show. It was October '77, and it was like I was the bartender at this thing. I was 18 years old. I just graduated high school, and I was the bartender at this event that was basically a who's who of anybody who was in comics at the time. Everybody from the tri-state area, from Neil Adams to Gray Morrow to Jim Starlin to all the studio, and a million people were at this thing for Bernie's opening, and I was kind of sitting there in awe, because I think people forget that we do this for a living, but we all started as fans, and most of that evening was a blur, except for Barry Smith turning his nose up at the wine that I gave him. But the one thing I do remember is just walking around looking at the artwork that night when I had the opportunity, and just being amazed at the stuff that I saw on the wall and the diversity of approaches and styles that he was attempting at the time. He was doing everything from pen and ink to painting, and each painting he did, if you guys remember the Christopher Enterprises posters that he did, each one was a different style and technique. He was really pushing himself in so many different ways, and I just kind of walked around there, knowing this is what I wanted to do for a living, going, oh, how am I ever going to do this? This is what I have to compete with. But most of all, what I remember from that night is at the very end of the night, after the thing was over and people had left and Bernie was still there with the owner of the gallery, he came over to me. He had no idea who I was. I was some kid who was just bartending at his function, and thanked me for everything I did that night. And he was the most gracious person. And I sat there going, wow, it's a normal guy who does all this stuff. And I kind of never forgot that. I always wanted to say that if I ever made it in the industry, that I would be that genuine with people and that accommodating. And we met again years later. He had dropped out of the convention scene for a long time. I started working right after that. I broke into the industry about 6 months after this event. And about 15 years later, he was back doing shows again, and I had walked up to him, we hadn't seen him since then, and relayed the story to him. And he didn't remember it all, but he found it fascinating and so engaging. And we kind of hit it off because of that. It was sort of a bond that we formed because of that meeting that he didn't remember for the life of him. But I got to know him as a person, and while I marveled at everything that he did, it was just, he was so self-effacing, and just, he would rather talk about your work or somebody else's work than his own work. And if you asked him to talk about his work, it was just, he was uncomfortable doing it because it's just what he did. And he felt weird with the accolades, and it's just the kind of guy he was. And I always took sort of a note from him as to how to approach my own attitude toward my work and my career. It's basically, I'm lucky enough to be doing this. I'm really happy you like my work, but hey, look what you're doing, and that's one thing that I've always gotten from him.
Anybody else? First impressions meeting Bernie, early memories of meeting Bernie, and what those early interactions were like?
Sure, I can follow up on
Yeah.
actually. Let's do this here.
Yeah.
Actually, if you want to flip through,
Yeah.
there's the poster for the exhibit that Joe was
That's
just
the
talking
poster.
about. That is the first thing I ever had signed by Bernie Wrightson. We met him, Tom and I, anyway. Well, I met him for the first time at this show, the FrazettaCon. So that's signed, it says to John from Bernie Wrightson, FrazettaCon, 1977. And it was a month before the show.
The exhibit, yeah.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, he was one of my huge idols, and I finally got the chance to meet him, so I grilled the shit out of him, you know? And, you know, I found out all kinds of things about how he worked. Found out that he was using Gillette 290 pen tips. The whole, you know, immediately ran out and bought some. But he
Because obviously you could do what he was doing,
so,
right? It's only about the tip.
yeah, he
Then
was
I'll be
so
able to draw like Bernie.
right. He was so forthcoming with any information, whether it was technical, how he did this, how he did that. Anyway, so at that show, there were a couple other pieces there we'll probably get to later. Was the first exposure I had to his Frankenstein work. You know,
When he was, he was first doing it, yeah.
And there were a couple images in there that were ones that I remembered being the first that I'd seen.
The thing that was most amazing about those plates, don't know if you remember, is that when I was talking to him about them, he penciled every single line of those plates first to make sure he knew what they were going to look like, and then he inked every single line. There's no whiteout, and if there's a highlight on a jar or somewhere else,
Right.
he penciled every single. That's why it took him forever. He penciled every single line, and then inked over every single line, so there's no whiteout anywhere on any one of those
Right.
plates. It boggles my mind that he was able to do that.
Yeah, we can talk a little bit more about that later too, because I've got some images. But anyway, he you know, he had the Frankenstein stuff. He had, I mean, you know, there must have been some of the Christopher Enterprises. Another poster I got from him was the Loggerhead poster. That
Yeah,
might
we
be
can-
the next one on.
Yeah,
there.
actually, we can skip through some of the
We can go to the
Frankenstein stuff
Loggerhead.
and just, yeah.
This was on exhibit at
At the gallery, right.
art
Yeah.
gallery, yeah, and that was the first Christopher Enterprises posters that I bought, and I got him. I'm pretty sure I got it from him at that same FrazettaCon, and I was always fascinated with the technique. It looked nothing like anything he'd ever done.
But none of them looked like any of the others.
That's true.
You know, every single one. One was an oil painting, one was line work and watercolor. This
Yeah.
thing was like a Chinese
And he
Chinese
did it all
watercolor,
wrong
you
and
know?
got like these amazing pictures out of it.
Right.
With this one, I was talking to him about it, and I said, "What were you using on that?" You know, he said, "Well, you know, it was this particular kind of watercolor paper that he was using, maybe colored inks, watercolors, regular ink." And he said, "Oh, he said when I was working on that, I was pulling my hair out." The thing was, because it was watercolor paper, and he didn't know that you were supposed to soak watercolor
Right,
paper,
right.
tape it down, and then work on it. He just went straight at it, and he said it started to curl up like a bowl. He said it was like working in a bowl. And I was cracking up, and he's describing this, you know, and I knew why it was doing that,
Yeah.
because I'd had some training. But what was amazing is that even though he was working in this like incredibly like naive fashion, he got this great painting out of it.
I accidentally, yeah. It's like
Yeah.
what was it, Knuckles Lonesome? He
Yeah.
talked about how he inked all the figures first, and then he washed over them, but he inked them with water soluble ink, and they all blend, and all the line work just started to blend. And he went, "Oh my God, wait, I can make that work!" And he just
Right,
turned
he
around
went
and did
with the
something else with it.
flow
But all the line work just blur.
Improvise.
Yeah,
I remember,
yeah.
we were talking about that one too. But it was just amazing how he would just figure out that, you know, it doesn't work like that. It works like this.
Yeah.
Even though it's not supposed to.
Yeah.
So I'll do whatever it's telling
Yeah,
me to
he was
do,
the original
you
happy
know?
accident guy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was really impressed with that one. And plus, it's a great picture of a giant snapper eating a boat with a guy in it. So how can you not love it, you know?
I'm trying to remember when I first met him. I went, my first New York con I went to, I grew up in Sacramento, but I went out to the East Coast and went to a show in '73, and I'm sure he was there, and I saw him give a talk, because there was a slideshow of the studio, or each of those guys. I don't know if their studio had formed yet. In this huge hall, a Commodore hotel, this huge hall in this old New York hotel with it's like the size of a movie theater, a big old movie theater, this huge screen, and all their artwork was projected on this screen, and it was just mind-boggling to see that work so big. It was spectacular. But then I came back to the East Coast 3 years later, went to the Jill Kubert School, and I had corresponded with a guy who puts on the Thanksgiving conventions that happen Thanksgiving weekend, and he invited the Kubert students through me to come and set up. And that's where I would have first really actually talked to him. Mm-hmm. And so I knew who he was whenever it was some months later we went to the Frazetta Con, and there he was. I recognized him and had talked to him a little bit from time to time. But the conversation I remember best was that Michael Kaluta was real friendly to me and invited me up to the studio when it was really happening, and all four of them were there in their corners of this room. For those of you who don't know, Bernie Wrightson, Jeffrey, Catherine Jones, Barry Windsor Smith, and Michael Kaluta, the four of them had this incredible studio for a while, and they were just doing this mind-boggling work. They all had success, mostly in comics. And then they kind of abandoned that and just launched into outer space with this spectacular work. And I got to go there, got invited, hung out there for a little while, and Bernie started talking to me. He had this big drawing on his drawing table, this huge pencil drawing with a graph on it to figure out from the sketch to blow this. Without a projector, you can blow up a drawing using a graph system. It's an old classic technique, mm-hmm. And it was a drawing of a mad pipe organ player, and this Bernie Wrightson thing, with his hands, playing this giant, wild-looking pipe organ. And he turned around and started chatting to me, and I was, and he was self-effacing about his work, and that he wasn't like that into, going into it. We ended up talking about UFOs, and he told me this great UFO story about a UFO that crashed in some town in the Midwest, and the occupant died, and so the townspeople buried him in their graveyard, and because they're very religious, they'll never let anyone dig it up. It's like, oh, that's my nice story. And then Jeff Jones came over with a bottle of beer in his hands, and he pointed at this incredible, magnificent pencil drawing. He goes, "Oh yeah, the man with the big organ." And then that was Jones said. So anyway.
Jason, any early memories? I mean, you're somebody who's maybe got a bit different perspective.
I've only met Bernie Wrightson one time. It was a couple years ago here at Heroescon, and I got over to his table right near the end of the show on I believe it was Saturday, and him and his wife were getting ready to pack up and leave, and I got up the nerve to show him my portfolio, and he had nothing but kind words to say, and it really hit me hard because, the first thing I ever saw of Bernie Wrightson's work was Swamp Thing number 10, and that was the cover of Arcane fighting Swamp Thing, and before that, I had only seen superhero stuff like Kirby and that kind of stuff, and I was starting to get into horror movies at that age, and I saw the Swamp Thing cover, and it just changed my whole perspective on comics artwork and what it could be. And I went to the local comic book store and tried to dig up all the other issues of Swamp Thing, and I just got as much Bernie Wrightson artwork, or comics and magazine work that I could possibly get. And over the years, I'd seen that Wrightson was at many different shows that I was at as a guest, and unfortunately, he was such a huge star in my mind that I was too afraid to, go up to him and introduce myself and meet him and everything, and I waited too late, Wrightson's brushwork well, I can't really just pinpoint his brushwork because he was a master of all tools, but his brushwork in particular just hit me so hard. I was, in my young days as an artist, I was really focused on using a quill. But whenever I looked at Bernie's brushwork, in my mind, that was like, that's what I wanted my stuff to look like. I wanted to emulate that. And but it took me so long to get out of the Procreate work because the brush scared me. But I picked up a copy of A Look Back, and that book, looking through that and all the brushwork and just that really hit me, and I started to you know, practice with my brushwork and everything, and that's the focus of my career, is to try to emulate Wrightson's inking style. That, you know, I just can't really put into words the impact he's had on my career. You know, it's hard for me to do. You know, I'm sad though that, you know, I didn't have the guts, you know, 20 years ago to go up and meet Bernie and you know, say more to him and thank him. You know, I waited too long.
Well, I think it
for
goes
that.
back to what I was saying about, you know, we are all fans underneath it.
Yeah.
And I've had, there are
Yeah.
guys who have passed away that I've had that same lament for, that
It's
I
such a
didn't take
regret,
the time
you
to go
know,
say
I just-
hello, you know, because I was intimidated to do it. So I try to do that now as much as possible, you know, with the
Yes.
guys that are still around that I really admired when I was younger, because I know how I feel about the fact that I missed the opportunity with some of the guys that I really liked.
Yeah.
What was, Joe, to your point, since everybody's a fan, what was your initial reaction to the work? I mean, you're all at the time fans, and I assume interested in aspiring artists. What's sort of that reaction
Was
to the
that
work
for-
the first time you see it?
Is
Was
that for me?
Joe's
To
reaction?
everybody.
Oh.
Yeah, to everybody.
Well, I had mentioned earlier the first time.
Yeah.
Well, I had seen it. I was more of a Marvel kid when I was younger, but I loved the DC horror books more than the superhero stuff. You know, like I loved the Neil Adams covers and the Bernie Wrightson covers more than Neil's superhero stuff. I loved his genre stuff.
Yeah.
The horror covers, the Western covers, anything that wasn't superhero, I thought was brilliant. The superhero stuff kind of bored me. But so I would pick those up, and that's where I first saw Bernie's work. There was one he did. There was one double page spread with a cat statue or something like that I remember. That was just, it was different from the stuff I was looking at, which I found fascinating. It was all stylized and cartoony. I was like, this is like really weird, but it's really, really cool. And when they had that gallery exhibition, and I got to see the originals, and he had the Batman issue was in a binder, and I was leafing through. You know, I was looking at that shot of that horizontal panel of Batman with the mile-long cape. You know, and I was just going, this looks like nothing else I've ever seen anybody else do. And just seeing the diversity in his work and the craftsmanship in it, it made me realize that you really have to dedicate yourself to what you're doing to become good and never be content with what you're doing. And I don't think he was ever content with what he was doing. He always wanted to get better, and it showed by the fact that he was trying so many different things. You know, he was never lazy. And that was one of the things that I got from his work, is that to never be lazy with what I do.
How about you?
The first time I met Bernie, I was very young, and I was in '77, one of the New York shows, and the studio was there, and I showed him some of the work that I was doing as a fan at the time, and he gave me some good pointers, and he was just so sweet and nice. They all were, oddly enough, even Barry Smith. Yeah, I mean, Barry Smith came to me the next day. I was just hanging out and looking, and I think Jeff had the Blind Narcissus print up, and that was just rocking my world and changing my life, and I kept looking at it. And so Smith came up to me, having seen my work the day before, and he said, "There's a guy walking around who wants to put something together, you know, I thought of you, he's gonna be blah, blah, blah." He made this introduction, which was very kind of him to do, I thought. In any case, because Bernie's passing has affected me so much, I'm gonna quickly tell you this story, and I'm gonna shut up and I won't say any more, otherwise I'll just burst up. But I was in Paris, this is many years later, about 10 years ago, and I was there with Ty Templeton and Neil Adams, and we were a 3-person Batman conglomerate going from place to place and signing all over France, and it was mostly France and Belgium. And so we had just finished up a place in the north of France. We were in Paris for a signing, and we were heading then to Brussels. And Ty Templeton and I, every morning, whatever city we were in, we would get up, we would have this fantastic breakfast. They always have these fabulous spreads in European hotels, and they're always free, and you just eat breakfast and you're fortified for the day. And we go out and just see things. Well, we're in Paris. We had heard that Jim Lee and some of the Wildstorm guys were going to be about, doing a signing of some sort at some point here, maybe in the same weekend, but not at the place we were going to be at. So we said, well, we might see them, we might run into them. We're walking along, and we're just in front of, I think, the Eiffel Tower, or close to it. But anyway, wherever Princess Di died, we were close to that, all right? So we're walking across the boulevard, and I look across, and there I see Bernie Wrightson and his girlfriend at the time, whose name was Joy. And I just stop, and I almost get hit by a car. It was like, I shouldn't stop, and Ty's going, what's up? And I go, that looks just like flipping Bernie Wrightson. And Bernie is pointing at me, and Joy is pointing at me. And so, and we get together and we go, oh my God. I said, are you guys with the Wildstorm people or something? They said, no, I'm doing a signing of my own, a whole thing. We just came from Brussels. We're on our way to The Hague, but we stopped in Paris just to do it, just for a little vacation between signings. It was entire serendipity. It was incredible serendipity. And so we just had a full day together. We spent the entire day together. We went and got lunch. They had to go to Le Père Lachaise to see stuff there at the cemetery. And we told them, 3 o'clock, that's our signing. Come and surprise Neil, who's going to be there. We'll love to see you, I'm sure. So Bernie then and Joy show up at the signing, and I had told the fans, look, you may want to hang out because Bernie Wrightson may show up. So they all just hung. So this place was hugely crowded, and people wouldn't leave. Wow. And then Bernie shows up, and next thing you know, he's doing sketches for people, wow. and it was just great. And he and Neil got to visit. And then after that, Joy and I and Ty and Bernie all went out, and we had dinner, and we just had the evening together. And it's one of the most fond memories I have in life that this just happened out of the blue. Wow. And Bernie told that story often as well. And one time we were together, and Richard Case had not heard the story, at least from Bernie, but Bernie launched into it with him and told it, and it was just so funny. So that was my great golden moment with Bernie, and I treasure it very much. And the only thing else I treasure almost as much, was when Bernie and I would be at Heroes, and we would do a sketch. He would draw something, and I would paint on it, and we'd put it in the auction.
Oh.
We did 4 or 5 of these over the course of years,
great.
and it was great. And he had done a drawing of something, and I can't remember which one it was, but he had done the drawing, and I was painting away, and Bernie and I would always be sitting next to him, one another. And so he stands up, he comes across, he's looking down at it, and he just does this. Just like that, It was just the sweetest thing in the world,
He appreciated it.
And it meant the world to me. And that the love and affection in that one pat on the head from one of my great gods is still very...
It's so him, too.
Yeah.
It really is. It's so him. Yeah, it reminds me, it was back in the mid-'90s when we had finally formed a friendship. We started to do like a little touring thing together. We would do store signings and do cons. We would do the same cons together and stuff like that. And we were down in New Orleans doing a store signing on Memorial Day weekend, so nobody was at the store. Everybody was gone. The guys at the store saying, he said, well, I'm great I come up with ideas, but I'm horrible at promotion. So Bernie and I sat there for all day at this store with maybe 6 people who came into the store all day long. And we went out to dinner that night, and we decided, well, we're here, let's go have a good time. So we went out, and we're walking down along Bourbon Street, and we're throwing back hurricanes like there's no tomorrow. And I don't know how this happened. I found a picture of it recently, and it sparked a memory that I had, but we ended up in some bar on Bourbon Street that had this big outdoor patio and a deck, and we ended up slow dancing on this deck, and Bernie's got his hand on my ass, and we're slow dancing, and he's got this look on his face like he's in heaven, and all I'm thinking of is, oh, Bernie Wrightson's grabbing my ass. But that was him, you know. So the guy who did the head and the feet and the axe is slow dancing with me, grabbing my ass in New Orleans. You know, that's what I mean about the juxtaposition between his work and him.
Yes.
It was really funny.
Oh, great, brilliant.
You know, and
That's a great story.
not to monopolize. Then
Wow.
there's one other time then when he had broken up with Joy. I was living in Pittsburgh, and his girlfriend was living in Pittsburgh, and one Sunday morning I get a phone call, and it's Bernie on the phone, and he goes, "Joe, it's Bernie." I said, "Yeah." He goes, "Can I stay at your house today? Because I just broke up with Joy, and I don't want to drive all the way back to Saugerties." So what he had done is he had gotten up in the morning and he had gone for cigarettes, and on the ride back to our house, he just went. Because I just kept on going. He goes, I couldn't make the turn anymore. It was time, and I kept on going. So he came to my house, and he hung out for the night. He slept on my sofa. And I got up in the middle of the night to get something to drink or go to the bathroom, and I'm standing there in the dark, and I'm looking at my sofa, and I'm like, wow, Bernie Wrightson's sleeping on my sofa. And in the retelling, that sounds really creepy, you know, but I'd like to, right. But I'd like to think that he would appreciate that, and if he ever drew that, he would have me standing there with an axe, you know, staring at him on the sofa. Yeah.
Wow.
Any questions from the audience, sir? Right here. Hold on. We've got a mic, so we can everybody can hear you.
I have my loud teacher voice.
Yeah.
So I got to tell this story to Bernie a couple of years ago, and I'll share it with you because he really enjoyed it. I grew up in South Florida. It's blisteringly hot down there. I'm about 12 years old, and I'm walking up the street, and I see that Mrs. Madaleno has put her trash out, and I walk by, and I don't know why. I turned around, opened a box, and it's a stack of early Warren magazines, and my life is forever changed. It's like superhero seems so boring now, and it was my first introduction to well, I'd seen the Conan paperbacks, but it was my first introduction to Frazetta and to Neil Adams, but it also had the fan drawing that Bernie had done that was published in Creepy #7.
I remember that.
So when I told that story to Bernie, he just appreciated it so much. And the humility factor here. Now, here is one of the guys that I think is truly one of the greatest artists of the last half century. So he says, "Did you become an artist?" And I said, "Well, of sorts." I said, "I could never draw the way you can, but I ended up teaching art for 35 years. And he was like, "Oh, thank you so much for being," I mean, he was so much more interested in hearing about my career as an art teacher than he was talking about his own work. And that just absolutely meant so much to me. So that's my story.
He would talk about his work, but he would talk technicalities with us. But he didn't like talking about his work in terms of it being praised. He was uncomfortable with that. He really was.
Joe, to your point, as I was certainly preparing for this discussion today, read a couple interviews from him in the mid-'90s talking about Frankenstein and the work that went into that. And to your point about sort of being self-effacing, he highlighted in an interview that he spent 6 years working on Frankenstein, but it wasn't constant, and in his words, it sounds worse than it really was, which is, I think, to your point, a very kind of self-effacing and somebody who isn't comfortable with talking about maybe his own work beyond maybe some of the technical aspects.
You know, there was an interesting thing about Bernie for me, or about his artwork, is his sense of design. I just want to mention that.
Yeah.
It just, his ability to design a picture, and like you're saying, he would draw. It's not like he's just doing these gesture strokes. He figures it out. Mm-hmm. He draws it. He draws that brush line before he inks it. But I was not a huge horror fan in generally speaking, but the way he did it was just spectacular, over the top. The way Angelo Torres and Wally Wood, those guys in the early Warren books, and Wrightson, who came in a few years later and did it for DC and then Warren, that stuff is just mind-boggling to me. There's some other intangible something to it that makes it wonderful. You know, and it's like it doesn't have any relationship to me to like modern slasher movies. It's some kind of beautiful thing, but it's horror. It's disemboweled people with their entrails on the floor. And somebody, it may have been Coluto, was snickering about Bernie Wrightson one time and said, there was an anatomy class, with real cadavers at art school that I was going to go sit in on, and so he thought, "Oh, Bernie, you got to go come in and sit in on this. Either, come on." And so Bernie went, and about 2 minutes into it, he turned green and ran out the door. So it was all fantasy to him. It was just coming up out of his id somehow, these images, which I think Frazetta was like that.
Yeah.
These images would just project themselves out of their subconscious, and it's just got all this juice to it that is really hard to access for a lot of it. We have to really work hard to access that place, and he just had
Bernie
it.
told a story talking about Frazetta, about how they were at a con together, and this is when Frank was back in the '60s, when he was still doing like the early Warren days, when he would do conventions, and he would actually draw stuff for people at the con, and he goes, I sat there and I was watching Frank one day, and he was drawing a Black Panther for somebody at the convention. He just kind of sat there, and Bernie was talking the way we're talking about Bernie. A panther. He was drawing up a cat for somebody at convention. He goes, I just watched Frazetta just draw this cat, you know, a perfect cat, right there in front of him, and he was just dumbfounded by it. And I must have heard that story from him about 10 times over the years, because it was just so impressed him. You know, so the way we're talking about him being able to do that stuff and just sit there and draw it, he had the same thing. It's that same fan thing, you know, where with the guys ahead of us and the guys that we looked up to, we never lose the awe for that. And he just really, he was just, that obviously had a very profound effect on him, watching Frank do that.
He told me a little bit about that. He didn't relate the drawing the panther, but he told, I didn't really get to hang out with him very much, unfortunately. I met him. He remembered my name. I would say, hi, Tom, when I see him at shows. But we just weren't in the same circles. I ended up spending most of my hanging out with these guys and with Al Williamson and some of this other crowd. But in later years, I saw him 2 years ago at San Diego, and he looked really frail. And I went, oh, Bernie, I've got to tell this guy how important his career was to me. And a year later, 6 months later, he was at a little show in Sacramento, and I found out he was there, and I called the promoter and said, you got to let me come to the show and sit next to Bernie. So I did. And I got to talk to him quite a bit, and that was just a year ago.
Oh, that's great.
And he looked a little better, actually, than he had at San Diego. And we went out and I bought him a beer, and we talked. And he told me the story about going to the convention as a little kid, or a little kid, he was a teenager or something. And there's Frank Frazetta doing sketches, and he just lit up. It's like us talking about him and talking about this, relating that story. You know, going to New York when he was real young and with his portfolio under his arm and all that stuff. Yeah. I'm really glad I got to do that. And again, he was just the most gracious, sweet guy you could imagine.
Always. I never saw him in a foul mood.
Listened patiently as I told him my story of discovering the fanzines, and he goes, yeah, that's the stuff I like too, and the early creepies, you know.
I think that the fan thing is maybe a little peculiar to the science fiction and comics realm. I mean, we all come from the same pool of enthusiasm for the form, and some of us become people who are proponents of it, you know, professionally, but that doesn't mean that we no longer understand, you know, that enthusiasm or share it. And the thing is that we're all in a line. Frazetta influenced Wrightson on a level that was just very quick. It was step one, them. Step two is them.
Right. Yeah.
Then I get Frazetta and Wrightson together, and they're influencing the living hell out of me, right? And then somebody will come up and say that I'm influencing them, but I'm part of that line, and that's another thing. Aren't you proud of that?
Yeah, very much so. Very much so.
Yeah, and I always want to acknowledge those people, and I still go back to them to this day. You know, if you really have to produce a lot of work and you're our age, you got to keep that fire going somehow. And I tell you, looking at that stuff, I go back to it all the time. You know, to get that juice, to want to keep trying to figure out how the hell do they do it. You know, and he's right up there at the top of the list for sure.
Now Bernie only, only worked on 10 issues of Swamp Thing, but for some of you all here on the panel, you had to follow in those footsteps a little bit and pick up Swamp Thing in the 80s when the series was revived. What was that like from your perspective, going from fan of his work to now working on something that really was
Well, I think John should talk about this more, because John, you had a way of drawing Swamp Thing that had Bernie's head. I didn't really draw Bernie's head. You know, I did the Bernie Swamp Thing because you guys revamped him, but you maintained his head that Bernie did, and I was always fascinated how you could do that. You know, and you obviously were real into it.
Yeah, I mean, that was just a matter of being a fan and having absorbed all the Berniness, you know,
right.
which is a good thing.
Yeah.
But then taking it to the next level, you know, and bringing in other influences, you know. Obviously, you know, as you guys were talking about, the Frazetta through Wrightson, through every one of us, you know, we belong to this sort of brotherhood of, you know, that thing.
Right.
And some of the other influences I brought into it were like, maybe though they weren't as apparent, but things like, you know, Virgil Finlay, which is not really part of that, the
Oh, yeah,
Frazetta
he's
Wrightson lineage. You know, it's a
yeah,
different
he's
thing.
in there,
it's
yeah.
conceptually different, but it fits if you know where to put it.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think that, and Steve, of course, bringing in his, you know, everything from underground influences to,
Yeah.
you know, the Goya stuff, you name it. I mean, it was
Right.
just a potpourri. But,
Incredible cinematic.
but his Bernie's vibe is under all of it. There's
Right.
no escaping it when
Yeah.
you do Swamp
Yeah.
Thing, you know.
And you guys met him later somehow, right? I don't know if you had met him very
well,
much earlier on.
The first
but,
time I met him was at that Frazetta Con.
right, but I mean, after you were doing Swamp Thing and it kind of reinvented it.
Oh, well,
you-
yeah, then it
you-
was, we would see him quite frequently on
Right.
the convention trail. But, well, I'll tell you a story. I mean, you know, everyone's been saying, you know, how sweet Bernie was, you know, and what a nice guy, self-effacing. All of that's true. You know, and the thing is, when someone dies, there's this tendency to, you want to build him up, and you know, you might think that, oh, well, they're exaggerating a little bit. And none of that is an exaggeration, you know. That is who Bernie was, but it goes a little bit more than that. It was, I think in 1992, I want to say it was in the spring, maybe April, I get a letter from Bernie, right? So this is weird because you don't get a letter from Bernie every day, right? So I open up the envelope, and there's a note from Bernie. There's a copy of a letter that he'd written to Paul Levitz at DC, and a check for $1,000 on Bernie's checking account to me. It's like, what is with this, right? So his note says, "Hi, John." He goes, "Please read the enclosed letter. It will explain everything. Bernie." So I read the letter, and basically what it was DC had sent Bernie a discretionary bonus payment of $5,000 for some Swamp Thing related thing. I don't know if it was a
Reprint.
toy or
Oh,
it was something like a toy or a cartoon or some goofy thing, right? And basically he wrote Levitz to say, well, thank you for the check. He goes, but I feel weird accepting it because the design is clearly based on Alan Moore, Steve Bissett, and John Totleben version of Swamp Thing and Rick Veitch, you know, and he said, I don't feel right accepting it, but here's what I did with the check. He split it up 5 ways between himself, Alan Moore, Steve Bissett, me, and Rick Veitch.
That's so him.
Sent us all
Yeah.
the check, you know.
That is
And the thing
amazing.
is, he didn't have to do that.
No.
I mean,
No
th-
doubt.
He
is-
created the
he
damn
is
character.
the co-creator of Swamp Thing. I mean,
Yeah.
it doesn't matter whose version they used. Okay, I mean, I have some pretty strong opinions on what constitutes creatorship of a character, but I won't get into that. But Bernie and Len were the creators of Swamp Thing.
Right.
Okay, we played with it,
Right.
but he felt so strongly that we should have gotten some of that action, you know, that he took it upon himself to split that check up.
That's amazing.
And
That is a great story.
yeah, and you know, it just shows this side of him. That, I mean, you talk about putting your money where your mouth is. I mean, in this case, maybe it was putting his money where his heart is.
Yeah.
But you know, it just shows that you know how the integrity of the guy.
Special
In
guy.
that,
Right.
I mean, he, you know, not that, I mean, I certainly, none of us, not Alan or Steve or I or any of it, would have thought that we had any right to any part of that. You know, it was Bernie's and Len's, and that was it. But that he felt so strongly and stuck by his convictions, you know, to do what he did like that. It's still one of the things, you know, you don't see that.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
But
And
that gives a
that's-
much deeper idea of what the guy was like.
It's a story I've never heard because it's not a story he would ever tell.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
He wouldn't blow
Exactly.
his own horn like that.
Right.
but I only heard it
Thank
from
you for
these
telling
guys.
that story.
Yeah, I'm glad you told that story. Yeah, it's pretty amazing. And I don't think Bernie was, you know, a wealthy guy who didn't need that check. I'm sure he did. Most all of us who toil in the comic book field, you know, the comic book publishers own the material. We don't. Fortunately, DC and Marvel, if they sell enough, will give you a little piece of it, which is what that was.
Right.
You know, so, I mean, he was still doing shows when he was very sick late in life because he needed the money, I imagine, you know.
Yeah, well, yeah.
I mean, unfortunately, that's just the way it goes.
Yeah, that's how we make our living.
Yeah,
You know?
that's it. You know, so for him to do that was really a big deal. I mean,
I'm sure it was. I mean, and this was, like I said, it was 1992.
92.
And
yeah.
I don't know what he was working on. He wasn't doing much that I remember around that time.
I can't.
You're talking the Hulk, Spider-Man, period.
Yeah, that might have been. Yeah, that might have
Was
been.
that
He
it?
was doing the graphic
So
novels
he
for
might have
Marvel.
been, yeah, maybe,
So maybe
he was
did,
doing a little
he was
better.
doing okay at that point.
Yeah, he might have been. But
I saw him in the 90s at one point, and he had something going on with his hands, and he
Well,
was in incredible pain.
he was having an allergic reaction to the ferrules on his brush, and it was kind of rotting his skin away, which sounds horrible, but it's kind of ironic because it's a guy who made a living drawing zombies, and his skin is rotting away. Yeah, right. So he was having a problem with his fingers because there was an allergic reaction to the metal on the ferrules of his brush, and he eventually found a way around that, taping them up or changing his brushes or something like that. But yeah, it was really weird. He had this really bizarre. I'd never heard of it before.
Yeah, I even saw him right when that was really
Yeah.
happening hard, and he was just sort of like at wit's end. He didn't know what to do.
Yeah.
You know, poor guy, felt bad, terrible.
Yeah, and like I said, I feel terrible, but honestly, it's kind of fun. It's
Yeah.
in a sick way that he would
Yeah.
appreciate. It's really kind of funny, and
Right,
he used to
right.
laugh about it also.
You're right.
I want to take a moment and just throw this out there, and I want to get you guys to talk about this, if you will, as well. And you brought up design. That's the thing. Design with Bernie is so clear. It's so well. Some people's design sense is obscured in their art, but it's not. It's made much stronger in Bernie's. And I've thought long and hard about Bernie and his art and the shadows and the way he spots his blacks and the way he feathers and does double lighting and the weight. I finally synthesized my thinking, and I finally came to the conclusion that when you look at a Bernie Wrightson drawing, the shadows have greater weight than they have in anyone else's art in terms of the black line. It is a combination of how he resolves that shadow as it turns in the form. It's the way it starts, what the hard line that it's
Right.
against.
Where the form breaks. and it
Right.
goes to dark.
It is unlike anyone else's, and someone else who has this same sort of thing in his black and white art is Frazetta. And I wonder if, to a certain extent, and we can all point out all the ways in which a Graham Ingalls or a Jack Davis might have had some influence, or even in the Will Eisner, the Lou Fine, Will Eisner sort of brush look that came along. But I see them both as having this incredible capacity to manifest form and create greater shape and greater volume than they really should. It's just printed material. It's black printed material.
On a
It
flat piece
shouldn't-
of paper.
Exactly. It
But
shouldn't
it's
do
got all this
this.
depth.
There's a piece that comes to
mass.
mind that kind of exemplifies what you're talking about. Do you ever see that Solomon Kane piece he did where he's lit from above and there's a werewolf in the foreground?
Yes.
And it's just, Solomon Kane's just solid blacks and whites.
Right.
But the volume in that figure, there's almost no turning of form, there's almost no feathering. It's almost solid blacks and whites, but it looks like it weighs a ton.
Exactly.
You know, and it's all black background and all. It's just like the highlights on the figure. And it really, it's an amazing piece.
Yeah.
Guys,
And it's so
just
much
to
thinking.
just to sort of segue maybe a little bit here for you guys, just to feed the conversation a little bit. We've got some images from Frankenstein. If you guys want to sort of talk to that from a technical standpoint, I'm not quite sure if you can see it down there, but we do have a couple images. I think Scott,
From a
to your
technical
point-
standpoint, it's absolutely insane.
I mean,
What
just-
was he thinking when he took on that thing? I mean,
Well, he was thinking about all the classic illustrators like Franklin Booth and others that and
He was a
that
big
he
influence
admired.
on this.
And he knew that he wanted to play with that one day, and so finally he did. But the thing is, it almost broke his back. I don't know that he ever did that kind of work again.
And I felt bad for him because everything he ever did after that was measured against Frankenstein.
Right.
And you can't expect his comic book work to look like Frankenstein, you know? And as well, it's not as good as his Frankenstein work. And he had to listen to that for the rest of his life.
Yeah.
You know, and while he never really, it never talked about how much, but it had to get to you after a while. You
Sure,
know?
yeah.
How do you constantly hear about how you're not as good as this? Nothing's going to be as
You
good
know,
as that.
there's an interview he did where the interviewer mentions that. You know, your new stuff, well, you know, it's okay, but you know, and he was he was kind of hemming and hawing around this subject, and Bernie just came right out and he says, yeah, this stuff I was more fired up or whatever, and he kind of owned it in this total Bernie, relaxed, calm, gentle way, you know? It was like, wow, man, that guy's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
But the
What
thing
a
is, the
human
Frankenstein
being.
work isn't his best work. It's great. It's beautiful. I love it. It's a great illustration. But man, nothing has ever rocked my sock so much as the work he did for Warren.
The Warrens.
Jennifer and
Yeah.
all the rest.
Yeah,
it's like
agree.
that's his great masterpiece.
Yeah, incredible stuff.
I just saw one of those I'd forgotten about recently in a box, you know, under the house. I was looking for something and I came across this Warren book and I had a story. I didn't even remember it. It wasn't Jennifer, but it was that same period.
Yeah, yeah.
It was a Bruce Jones, I imagine, wrote it, and it was just like, look at this thing.
But Muck Monster was another Warren one. It was
Yeah,
early
yeah.
Frankenstein, another
Right,
Frankenstein stuff with the protoplasm dripping, Pepper Lake Monster,
Oh,
the
Pepper Lake
Telltale
Monster.
Mark.
Well, that was in the
Yeah.
Frankenstein style. Pepper Lake Monster
Yeah,
wasn't
Right,
washed.
we've got
It was
a couple images of Pepper Lake Monster if you want to.
Yeah.
as well.
And that was my favorite.
It's incredible.
You know, there was
love that
something
splash page,
about
yeah.
the Warren magazines where almost anybody who went to work for them produced like the best work of their career. Russ Heath did incredible stuff for them. Everything Russ did, Ditko, the stuff he did for them. I don't know what it was
I
about.
loved
working for
Wally
Warren.
Woods.
You know,
stuff,
whether
yeah.
he just gave them he did give them basically total creative freedom, but there was something about
Yeah.
you know
And they were paying
the
more.
freedom they were paying more. Yeah.
Right. Oh, and Bernie had this one hilarious story that he told me, and I will tell it quickly to you. I'm the guy who said I wouldn't speak again, but I'm going to speak again. But no, Bernie told me this hilarious story, and you've doubtless heard it, but you got to hear this. This is great. Bernie went to work for Warren because Warren basically said, look, I'll pay you twice as much as your normal page rate, but I want the best work you've ever done. And he says, great. And it's all going to be black and white, and it can be any techniques you want, from opaques and gouache and acrylics to anything you want, you know? So Bernie said, okay, I'm going to do this. He gets going, and he finds himself short for cash. So he goes into the offices, and he says to Jim Warren, the publisher, says, Jim, I'm sort of short for cash. Is there any chance I could get an advance against this next story I'm about to do for you? And Jim Warren says to him, Bernie, sit down. He then says, Bernie, I have a rule. I don't give artists a cash advance against the work, and here's why. And he explains that, you know, if I give you the money now, you'll spend it on whores and you won't do the work. But I will give you a personal check as a friend, and it's a loan. And then, you know, so he says, great. So he takes the money, cashes it, he does his thing, he turns in the work, and about 2 stories later, he's short for cash. Do you remember this?
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
He's short for cash again. So he says, he goes into the office, he says to Jim Warren, he says, Jim, I wonder if I could get a personal loan from you. And Jim says, Bernie, sit down. I have a rule. I never make personal loans to artists because it establishes a sort of thing that I don't really feel comfortable with. On the other hand, I will give you an advance.
Wow. Wow.
Questions from the audience?
Anybody out there?
Anybody? No, feel free, please. You got another question? Knock yourself out.
Everyone has periods of their work that appeals to some artists and not to others. I have friends of mine who feel Bernie's best work was the comedic stuff he did, like Doc Stern. I won't lie, that stuff doesn't speak to my heart in the least. But his ability to switch from that kind of graphic Franklin Booth influenced horror to humor was remarkable. I mean, I had to appreciate his ability to do that even while the work wasn't work that spoke to me. So if you guys would have some
Well, I mean,
feedback to that.
if you look at his horror stuff, all of the horror stuff has a sense of humor to it. I mean, you can't do
Yeah.
something like Somebody Please Stop Me and not have a sense
Right.
of humor,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
it's so
That's
ridiculously over the top.
That's true.
Right.
So it's just how he decided to direct that humor in his
The
work.
Ichabod Crane character
Yeah.
from the Disney movie, it just appears all the time in his stuff.
Right.
Just like that implanted on his brain, I guess. He saw the Legend of Sleepy Hollow because that's the Ichabod Crane. From
right.
it. He's
Right.
all over Bernie's work.
Right.
It's the hilarious cartoon of a character.
The tall guy with the axe was sort of his mascot for a while. Back in
Right.
the '70s, there were a bunch of
Right.
drawings of that guy, and
Right.
it was Bernie having fun with that.
Yeah,
with just
yeah.
the absurdity of something like that.
The work that-
Mementos,
that's
is
what-
is
yeah.
absurd. You look
right,
at it, and you just have to laugh when you look at it. Going, what is wrong with this guy?
Yeah, right,
You know?
right.
He's talking
Mementos.
about a piece that Bernie did where there are a bunch of heads on the.
That's
posters.
Mementos.
That's Mementos, yeah.
Yeah.
And the thing is that Bernie was quoted as saying in many interviews, "Look, that's basically a lighthearted sort of image by my lights. If I wanted to scare you, I would have put feet on those posters."
Which he did the Unmen, in Swamp Thing were pretty strange stuff, but lovingly, he liked those Unmen,
Yeah.
He wasn't demeaning them, he was glorifying them. But for me, the stuff that knocked me out, look like we all have slightly different favorites, the stuff that knocked me out was the work he did at DC, particularly the cover art.
Yeah.
He
Brilliant.
just got on, right before Swamp Thing, he just got on this roll, and it's like every month there'd be a couple of covers by him, and he was just channeling something totally original, it wasn't Frazetta,
Right.
it wasn't Jack Davis, it wasn't Graham Ingalls, it was something completely new. It was like there was this one, it was all black with a close-up of a horrified Wrightson character whose fingers are
Right.
candles.
Right.
Right. And there was another one where there's this giant bat
Yeah.
sweeping down
giant
on
bat was incredible.
a running kind of medieval character who
Was
had
that one of those
like,
covers that they did in some sort of weird printing process?
And the printing process-
The original's a wash drawing,
yeah,
and they
and
colored and
DC
printed it. And, yeah.
Mesotear
for
or
those
something.
books, DC experimented with different printing techniques on the
Which I
covers.
love.
It wasn't just a regular old,
Jeff
Superman-looking
did one of those
artwork.
for Wonder Woman with,
Oh, I
with
know.
the headsman.
Yeah, and they were just pushing the boundaries like crazy. And I met Carmine Infantino at one point a few years ago before he passed away, and mentioned to him that how impressed I was by DC as a kid, those mystery books. When I was starting off, it wasn't the other stuff. That's what got me hooked. And he said, we were pushing the limits with everything we had. He was one of the editors-in-chief at that time, and he says, oh yeah, we were pulling out all the stops. We were doing stuff we'd never done before in those mystery books. We were trying to really kick it into high gear,
Well-
which is unusual because they're anthologies. They don't have any continuing characters. They're not promoting Batman with that or anything. It's
The thing is that you
magical
perceive
time.
it as a kid, and you just look at it and you go, first of all, I thought all comics were drawn at that size, so I had this very fine
Did you
line.
really?
Oh, yeah, they were tiny. So I drew my comics tiny like that. Because I just like Franklin Booth thought that those engravings were
Yeah.
pen and ink drawings, so
yeah,
he
yeah.
drew them. So,
Right.
And one of the things that I noticed was, I said, wow, all my favorite artists and all the best art that DC produces is done in these anthology books. And I said to myself, you know what? If you slog in the superhero world long enough, they'll reward you by allowing you to work on the mystery books. That's what I thought. So when one of my first assignments professionally was to do some stuff in those books, I said, wow, I just leaped over all that stuff. I can do this right away.
Got to do what you really wanted to do.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that's why I said earlier, I was more impressed with the stuff that Neil did for those books than the superhero stuff, because all of those guys seem to be
Yeah.
doing stellar work on those books.
Yeah.
There's
Maybe
something
the best
about them.
story I ever saw
Yeah,
from Neil
yeah.
Adams' Nightmare about
Yeah.
a little girl who meets
That's
Anna
his
in a
daughter.
garden.
That's his daughter. He still has all his originals.
That's
They're
brilliant.
hanging up in his office.
Oh yeah, just
Yeah.
beautiful,
He used his
exquisite
daughter for
stuff.
the
I
little girl.
completely agree. Yeah, I don't know what I think. Maybe it was your work is printed in black and white, decent printing, even though the paper wasn't high quality in the early days. It was decent printing, and the public could see your line. It didn't have a colorist who didn't understand lighting, who had, you know, I mean, there were some great colors there, like Tatiana Wood. Did Tatiana do Swamp Thing?
Yeah.
I think she did Bernie and all of our Swamp Things, and she was terrific contribution, and did Bernie's stuff justice, and like nobody else.
And
but
the
a lot of the
printing plates
colorists.
helped a lot also back then, because they were
Yeah.
still using the metal printing plates. And
Right.
When they went to plastic, the fine line just got
Yeah,
lost. Yeah,
right. That happened to me. My lines had wiggles.
Yeah.
With the plastic plates. But with Warren, you didn't have any of that other stuff. And plus, it didn't have to be overly G-rated. It could be a little racy or obviously gorier, you know, but you could really go to town. And I think all those guys did. I mean, you look at the stuff that Al Williamson did in 65 and 66 when he and his buddies were working there, and Krenkel and Frazetta and Angelo Torres and Gray Morrow. It's just, man, and there's experimental, you know, stuff going on,
Yeah.
the wash, and there's
And
something
it's funny,
about.
like you were talking
Look
about-
that stuff up, you guys.
You were talking about gory. If you really look at the whole body of Bernie's horror stuff, it's not really gory. You know, it's scary. He
Right.
drew scary
Mood.
shit. Yeah,
It's
it
mood.
wasn't gory. It's
Yeah.
like the same that Frazetta said one time when they started to license out his characters for stuff, and he didn't like what they were doing. He goes, people don't get it. He goes,
Yeah.
it's not about gore and
Right.
beheadings and stuff. That's not they don't get my work.
Yeah.
You know, and Bernie's stuff was not about gore.
Right.
You know, it was indications every now and you'd see an entrail and stuff, but it wasn't.
But it was a
about-
cartoon. It wasn't a
Yeah.
real entrail.
Yeah,
It was a cartoon of an entrail
Yeah.
with beautiful lighting and beautiful glistening highlights.
right.
And look at the story Jennifer that he did.
Right,
Every
yeah.
panel of this comic is a masterpiece of an illustration done in wash, but just when he needs to push into high contrast and leave the wash behind, he does, right? It's just, and that's that design sense. It's not just in the illustrations, it's in the flow of the story. He'll choose his moments to go high contrast, even in a tonal piece, and just having that sense and the ability to pull it off beautifully, and the angles he chooses.
That whole that whole segment in Jennifer when she crawls into bed with him, and it's one of the most unnerving things I've ever seen.
Oh, you talk about horror.
And then it ends with the bird's eye view, the down shot of the bed, of them in the bed together, with him just going no, you know, it's really the way he handled that particular
Brilliant.
sequence was really
brilliant.
incredible.
Yeah.
He was fearless, is what I take out of it, because I'll learn a trick, and then I think it has these parameters. You know, you have to draw it like this and this kind of a shot. And guys like him didn't have those parameters. He would just do stuff like drawing Batman's cape, a block long, or something. I wouldn't do that.
Right.
See, he's this tall, so he'd trip over it if it was longer than that.
Yeah, right,
So I'll
right.
figure it all out rationally. And he didn't have those kind of limits. He just had this courage to just make it look cool.
And I wonder if some of that came from the German expressionists in the film of the 20s.
Yeah,
Because,
he's a big fan of that.
Yeah, and Will Eisner and those guys were influenced by that somewhat, and I know that Bernie was. I mean, taking that skewed, say, the window,
Right, the window panes, yeah.
yeah, you get that reflection of all that shadow and light on the wall, but it'd be at this wonky angle that would
Yeah.
never happen.
That
in real
wouldn't
life.
happen. I remember
it's
trying
pure
to create that.
expressionism. It's German expressionism.
Yeah.
And that gives them. That was what clued them in. It's like, at some point, we allow ourselves, we give ourselves permission to accept something as romantic and strange and diabolical and surreal as that, and say, yeah, I'm going to go with that.
Right.
And when you do, you can never look back, and you will always be able to do that, or be able to conjure it in your work if you choose to.
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
that shot of Batman with the mile-long cape, a panel later, it was a different length again. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
But it just worked for that panel. It worked
Yeah.
for that effect.
Yeah.
was
It took me
was a
forever
dramatic effect.
to get to
and
that.
the fact that it was 7 feet shorter in the next panel didn't bother you at all.
No.
You know, it was just it worked.
Because it looked so cool.
Yeah.
Heck with the reality, man. I'll pick this over reality, you know?
Exactly.
Jason, you've been pretty quiet. What's the
I'm just loving listening to the story.
what's the Bernie work that really spoke to you? What's the work that you really connected with
This
from him?
Swamp Thing stuff for me, initially, the Swamp Thing stuff initially hit me. But the more that I looked at the creepy and eerie stuff, especially the little illustrations that he'd do on the inside cover, those illustrations, to this day, I go back and I look at those, and those affect me just as much as the story work that he did. They just had a power to them, each of them. And he just, even when he did the simple little, just headshots of like Uncle Creepy up in the corner, like you were saying, Joe, or Scott, I think, about the weight and the volume, you know, there was so much.
Yeah, it's just a little tiny
Just,
headshot.
yeah, but there, it was there, you know, like you could touch it, you know, like a 3D or something, you know, and these guys have said so much that I think that I can't, you know, speak on like they do, but, you know, I'm just speechless when I think about Wrightson, so I just, you know.
Any last questions? I know we're running a little bit long here, but any last questions from the audience? Sir, right back here. Oh, hold on. We'll get the mic for you.
I was just curious, have you heard anything about any publishers bringing back some of the out-of-print work?
Well, I know there's a tribute book being done of his. I'm not sure about how much it's going to have of his stuff in it. I know he has. I don't know how much finished work he has that hasn't been published. I'd have to talk to Liz about that. But I've told her that she should not stop doing shows. That she should really keep that legacy alive, and because it'd be a shame for his work to not be seen by people anymore. And really, I think the smartest thing that she could do for all of us is to keep him in the public eye as much as possible. You know, whether it's prints or merchandise. Yes, she's our friend as much as Bernie was. You know. Well, there's an artist edition coming out, but it's also it's stuff that has been published. I don't know that there is much in the archives.
Yeah, it's a DC material.
Yeah.
It got
Yeah.
rights to, yeah. We're all trying to scare up artwork for it.
Yeah.
Anybody got the originals from DC era out there? Bernie Wrightson originals? Get a hold of IDW and get them scanned.
One of the most intimidating things I ever did, speaking of artwork, was I got to work over his pencils. When he was doing that bizarre Punisher incarnation that Marvel Knights did for a while, he was drawing the interiors, and he didn't have time to do the covers because he was trying to keep the deadline on the book. So he penciled these halftone pencils for the 4 covers, and he asked me if I would paint them, and I was like, what? I was like, what? But luckily he had penciled them on crappy paper, so I didn't have to work over them. What I did was I transferred them onto a board, and I worked over the transferred pencils. And I tried as hard as possible to keep it looking like Bernie, you know, so I basically kind of went over almost every single line that he did and tried to paint on top of that. And it's sort of a combination of Bernie and myself at the same time, but he loved them. I thought that there was only one cover that was successful. The others were kind of, you know, so because how do you paint like
Probably
Bernie?
all great, but we're always the
Yeah,
worst
you know.
critics of ourselves.
But based on that, we had decided at one point that we would do a print together. Since we did shows together all the time, that we would do a print and we would collaborate on this big painted print. So he had drawn this thing out where it was a girl sort of at a pond in the woods, and there's rocks behind them, and there's like werewolves and little gremlins and stuff, and there's a moon behind it. And he left the girl blank, and he said, "You do better women than I do. So you draw the woman in the foreground. I'll do the monsters, and we'll collaborate, and we'll just send it back and forth to each other and keep painting this thing." And we got tied up with work, and we never did it. So I have the finished pencil at home, and there's a Wrightson tribute book being done by a bunch of different artists. I'm going to finish this piece for the tribute book, so people finally get a chance to see it.
Excellent. That's brilliant.
That's wonderful.
Well, guys, thank you for the time. I think this has been certainly a great conversation, some great perspective. Everybody, round of applause for our panel today.
Yeah, for Bernie.
Thank you, and thank you, Bernie.
Yeah, and certainly thank you to Bernie. Round of applause for Bernie, please.
Yeah.